more you make yourself available, the more you become invisible. You feel it, don't you? That quiet, uncomfortable shift when your presence stops mattering. At first, you think it's just in your head. You tell yourself they're busy, distracted, dealing with something. So you compensate. You lean in harder. You reply faster. You give more. You become easier to reach, easier to access, easier to consume. And without realizing it, you start erasing your own value. You think being consistent, being reliable, being always there will make people respect you more. But actually, it does the opposite. It conditions them to expect you, to predict you, to take you for granted. And once someone can predict you, they stop appreciating you. And most people never realize this. They stay trapped in this loop for years, giving more and more, hoping that one day the return will match the effort. But it never does, because the game you're playing is already rigged against you. You're trying to earn value through presence, in a world that only respects scarcity. And that's where the pain starts. You know the exact moments I'm talking about. When you send a message and watch the screen, waiting. When you see them online but they don't respond. When you start questioning yourself, wondering if you said something wrong, if you did too much, or worse, if you weren't enough. But the truth is colder than that. It's not about what you said. It's about how available you've made yourself. When someone knows they can have you anytime, they stop feeling urgency. And without urgency, there is no attention. Without attention, there is no value. You've been taught that effort equals reward, that if you show up consistently, people will recognize it. But human nature doesn't work that way. People don't value what's always there. They value what they might lose. That's the part no one told you. You've been playing by rules that don't exist, and it's costing you your time, your energy, and your self-respect. You keep thinking the solution is to give more, to be better, to prove your worth. But the harder you try, the more you reinforce the exact behavior that makes you invisible. Because every time you overextend, every time you make yourself instantly available, you send a signal, a quiet, unspoken message that says, "I'm here, no matter what. You don't have to earn me." And once that message is received, it's game over. Not in a dramatic way, not with a loud ending, but in a slow, subtle fade. You become background noise, familiar, comfortable, ignored. And that's the part that hurts the most, because you didn't mean to get here. You thought you were doing the right thing. You thought loyalty, consistency, and presence were strengths. And they are, in the right context. But without boundaries, without control, they become liabilities. They turn you into something people consume instead of respect. And deep down, you felt this before. That moment when you pulled back, even slightly, and suddenly, people noticed. They asked where you were. They reached out. They paid attention. And you brushed it off as coincidence. But it wasn't. It was the natural response to absence. Because absence creates tension. It creates space. And the human mind cannot tolerate empty space. It needs to fill it with thoughts, with curiosity, with focus. When you're always present, there's no space left for that. No room for imagination. No reason to think about you, because you're already there, constantly, predictably, easily. And that's the trap. You've been trained to believe that more presence equals more value, when in reality, controlled absence is what creates it. This isn't about playing games. This isn't about manipulation. It's about understanding the psychological laws that govern attention and respect. You don't need to disappear completely. You don't need to become cold or distant for no reason. But you do need to stop being so accessible. You need to break the pattern. Because right now, you've made yourself too easy to reach, too easy to understand, too easy to forget. And the longer you stay in this pattern, the harder it becomes to change how people see you. They've already categorized you, already decided how much effort you're worth. And unless something disrupts that perception, nothing changes. So the question isn't whether you're valuable. You are. The real question is, are you presenting yourself in a way that allows others to see it? Or are you drowning it under constant availability? Because value isn't just about what you are. It's about how you are perceived. And perception is shaped by contrast. Presence and absence. Access and restriction. Noise and silence. Right now, you're all presence, no absence. All access, no restriction. All noise, no silence. And that imbalance is costing you more than you realize. But here's where it shifts. The moment you understand this, you can't unsee it. You start noticing patterns. How people treat those who are always around versus those who come and go. How attention spikes when something becomes less available. How respect grows when access is no longer guaranteed. And suddenly, your past experiences start making sense. All those times you felt overlooked, underappreciated, taken for granted. They weren't random. They were predictable outcomes of a pattern you didn't even know you were following. But now you do. And that awareness changes everything. Because once you see the pattern, you can break it. You can start reclaiming your time, your energy, your presence. You can start choosing when to show up instead of being expected to. You can start creating space instead of filling it. And in that space, something powerful happens. People begin to notice again, not because you asked them to, not because you tried harder, but because you stopped being everywhere, because you allowed absence to do what presence never could. Build tension, create curiosity, restore value. And this is just the surface, because what you're really about to understand goes deeper than just being available or not. It's about control, psychological leverage, the subtle shift between being desired and being ignored. And once you grasp that fully, you won't just change how others see you. You'll change how the entire dynamic works in your favor. You've been told that consistency is power, that showing up again and again builds trust, builds value, builds connection. But what no one told you is that consistency without scarcity becomes background noise, and background noise is not respected. It's tolerated, filtered, eventually ignored. And you've felt that shift before, even if you didn't have the words for it. That moment when your effort stays the same, but the reaction fades. When your presence no longer creates impact, but expectation. And expectation is dangerous, because once people expect you, they stop appreciating you. They stop noticing the effort behind your actions. They stop assigning value to your time. Because in their mind, it's always there, always available, always accessible. And something that is always accessible holds no urgency. And without urgency, there is no attention. Without attention, there is no perceived value. And that's the first illusion you have to break. The belief that being more available will somehow make you more important. Because in reality, it slowly erases your importance by removing the tension that makes people pay attention in the first place. And tension is everything. Tension is what keeps someone thinking about you when you're not there. Tension is what creates emotional investment. Tension is what separates the memorable from the forgettable. And you've been unknowingly removing that tension every time you respond too quickly, every time you say yes without hesitation, every time you make yourself fully predictable. Because predictability kills curiosity, and curiosity is the foundation of attraction, respect, and psychological engagement. And once curiosity dies, the dynamic becomes flat, lifeless, mechanical, and you become part of the routine instead of the exception. And human nature does not chase routine. It escapes it. It looks for variation, for unpredictability, for something that disrupts the pattern. And if you never disrupt the pattern, you become invisible within it. And this is where the psychological layer goes deeper, because the human brain is not designed to value what it already has secured. It is designed to prioritize what feels uncertain, what feels limited, what feels like it could disappear. And that's why absence works, not because it's manipulation, but because it aligns with how attention naturally operates. When something is always there, the brain categorizes it as safe, stable, non-urgent, and then shifts focus elsewhere. But when something becomes less available, even slightly, the brain reevaluates it. It asks questions. It creates scenarios. It fills in gaps. And those gaps are where your value is reconstructed. Not through what you do, but through what is no longer immediately accessible. And you've experienced this yourself. Think about the last time someone reduced their availability around you. They didn't necessarily improve themselves overnight. They didn't suddenly become more impressive, but your perception of them changed. You noticed them more. You thought about them more. You assigned more meaning to their actions, because their absence created space for your mind to engage. And that engagement is what creates perceived value, not constant exposure. And yet you keep doing the opposite. You keep increasing exposure, thinking it will increase importance, when in reality, it decreases it. Because the more someone sees you without effort, the less they feel the need to invest effort themselves. And relationships, attention, respect, they all operate on perceived investment. If someone feels they don't need to invest to have access to you, they won't. And over time, that imbalance grows. You give more, they give less. You try harder, they become more passive. And eventually you start feeling drained, confused, even resentful, wondering why your effort isn't being matched. But the answer is already embedded in the dynamic you created. You removed the need for them to invest. You eliminated the friction that creates value. And now you're experiencing the natural consequence of that imbalance. So the first rule you need to internalize is control your availability, not in an emotional, reactive way, but in a deliberate, structured way. You stop responding instantly to everything. You allow time to pass, not as a tactic, but as a boundary. You understand that your time has weight, and you don't distribute it freely without consideration, because every time you give immediate access, you reduce the perceived weight of that access. And when access has no weight, it has no value. So you start creating small delays, small spaces, moments where you are not immediately reachable. And those moments begin to rebuild the tension that was missing. And people start noticing, not consciously at first, but subtly. They feel the difference. They feel that access to you is no longer guaranteed, and that uncertainty reactivates their attention. And from there, the second rule becomes clear. You disappear with purpose, not randomly, not to provoke reactions, but to invest in something beyond immediate validation, because absence without growth is empty. It's noticed once and then dismissed. But absence combined with evolution creates impact. When you step back and use that time to improve, to build, to refine yourself, your skills, your mindset, your direction, you ensure that when you reappear, you are not the same version that left. And that difference reinforces your value. It justifies the absence. It creates a narrative of progression. And people respect progression. They are drawn to it because it signals depth, focus, and self-control. And self-control is rare, and rarity is valuable. And that leads to the third rule: detach from the need to be constantly remembered. Because this is where most people fail. They are driven by the fear of being forgotten, so they compensate with constant presence, constant updates, constant availability, thinking that staying visible will secure their place in someone's mind. But the opposite happens. Overexposure leads to desensitization, and desensitization leads to indifference. And indifference is the death of value. So instead, you allow space, you allow silence. You accept that you don't need to be in front of someone all the time to matter. In fact, you understand that stepping away is what gives your presence meaning when you return. Because presence without absence has no contrast, and without contrast, nothing stands out. Nothing feels significant. And this is the loop you start to recognize and reinforce. You reduce availability, which creates tension. Tension creates attention. Attention rebuilds value. And that value allows you to maintain boundaries without losing connection. And as you repeat this pattern, you start to notice a shift not just in how others treat you, but in how you see yourself. You no longer feel the need to chase, to prove, to overextend. Because you understand that your value is not something you have to constantly display. It's something you control through how you manage your presence and absence. And that control changes everything. It changes the dynamic from reactive to intentional, from needy to composed, from overlooked to respected. And the more you apply this, the more consistent the results become. Not because you are manipulating people, but because you are aligning with the underlying psychology that governs attention and value. And once you align with that, you stop fighting for recognition and start attracting it naturally, because you are no longer everywhere. You are no longer predictable. You are no longer easy to access. You become selective, measured, deliberate. And that shift alone is enough to separate you from the majority, because most people will never break out of the pattern of over-availability. They will continue to equate effort with value, presence with importance, and they will keep experiencing the same results. While you operate differently, you create space, you maintain tension, you control access, and in doing so, you transform how you are perceived without needing to say a word. Because perception is not built on what you claim, it's built on what people experience. And what they experience when you master absence is not loss, but intrigue, not distance, but depth, not indifference, but controlled presence. And that is where real value begins to take shape, not in how much you give, but in how intentionally you choose when not to. Everything comes down to this: not your effort, not your intentions, not how much you give, but how much of you is actually accessible at any given moment. Because value is never measured by what is constantly present, it is measured by what is controlled, what is limited, what is not guaranteed. And once you understand that, everything you thought mattered starts to collapse. All the over-explaining, all the instant replies, all the endless availability, all of it loses its meaning. Because none of it created real respect, it only created comfort. And comfort without tension leads to indifference. And indifference is where you disappear without even noticing. And the reason this truth feels uncomfortable is because it forces you to confront something deeper, something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The realization that being liked is not the same as being valued, that being present is not the same as being desired, and that being accessible is not the same as being respected. And once you see that clearly, you can no longer go back to the old patterns. You can no longer pretend that giving more will fix a dynamic that was broken by overgiving in the first place. Because now you understand that every time you made yourself too easy to reach, you diluted your own presence. Every time you removed the need for someone to invest in you, you lowered the perceived cost of having you. And when the cost is low, the value is low. It's a simple equation, but one that most people refuse to accept because it requires discipline, restraint, and the willingness to be misunderstood for a period of time. And that's where the real separation happens. Because if you want to be respected, if you want to be desired, if you want to hold real psychological weight in any interaction, you must master absence, not as a trick, not as a temporary tactic, but as a fundamental principle of how you operate. You must learn to step back when your instinct tells you to lean in. You must learn to stay silent when your impulse tells you to explain. You must learn to delay when your habit tells you to respond immediately. Because in those moments, in that controlled restraint, you are redefining the dynamic. You are reintroducing tension. You are forcing the other side to re-engage, to reevaluate, to feel the absence you created. And that feeling is what rebuilds your position without you having to chase it. And this is not about playing games. This is about understanding leverage, psychological leverage that comes from controlling access to yourself. Because the one who controls access controls the dynamic. And if you don't control your own availability, someone else will. And they will do it in a way that benefits them, not you. And that's exactly what has been happening. You've been giving access freely, without boundaries, without structure, without intention. And in doing so, you handed over control of the dynamic without even realizing it. And now you feel the consequences of that loss of control, the imbalance, the lack of reciprocity, the fading attention. But here's the shift. The moment you take back control of your availability, everything starts to rebalance. Not instantly, not dramatically, but subtly, consistently, and most importantly, sustainably. Because now the interaction is no longer based on your willingness to give, but on their willingness to invest. And that changes everything. Because people only value what they invest in, whether it's time, effort, attention, or emotion. And if you remove the need for them to invest, you remove the possibility for them to truly value you. So if you want to be seen differently, you must behave differently. You must become less predictable, less accessible, less immediate. Not to create confusion, but to create space. And in that space, something powerful happens. People start to feel your absence. They start to notice the gap you left behind. They start to question, to think, to reach. And that reach, that effort from their side, is what restores balance. Because now the dynamic is no longer one-sided. Now it requires participation from both sides. And that is where respect begins. Not in what you give, but in what is required to access you. And this is the final rule. If you want to be valued, you must be willing to be unavailable. Not completely, not permanently, but intentionally, strategically, and without apology. You must be willing to let silence exist, to let messages wait, to let moments pass without filling them. Because every time you resist the urge to overgive, you reinforce your boundaries. And boundaries are the foundation of self-respect. And self-respect is what others ultimately respond to. Not your words, not your effort, but your standards. And your standards are revealed through what you allow, what you tolerate, and what you make easily accessible. So, if you continue to make yourself constantly available, you are setting a standard that your time, your attention, your presence can be accessed without effort, without consideration, without cost. And that standard will define how people treat you moving forward. But if you shift that standard, if you raise the threshold, if you make access to you something that must be earned, even subtly, even indirectly, everything changes. Because now your presence carries weight again. Now your time feels limited. Now your attention feels valuable. And that perception alone is enough to transform the way others engage with you. And here's the truth most people will never accept. They will keep chasing validation through visibility. They will keep overexposing themselves, over-explaining, over-giving, hoping that more presence will finally create the recognition they crave. But it never does. Because recognition is not created by how often you are seen. It is created by how much you are missed when you are not. And most people will never understand this because it requires patience. It requires restraint. It requires the ability to sit in silence without panicking, to step back without fearing loss, to trust that your value does not come from constant presence, but from controlled absence. And that is a level of discipline that most people are not willing to develop. They will choose comfort over control, immediacy over impact, availability over value, and they will continue to wonder why they are overlooked. While you operate differently, you step back when necessary, you create space when needed, you allow absence to do its work, and in doing so, you build a presence that is not based on noise, but on weight, not on frequency, but on impact. And once you reach that point, you no longer chase attention, you attract it. You no longer fight for respect, you command it. And you no longer fear being forgotten, because you understand that what is rare is never truly forgotten. It is remembered, anticipated, and valued at a level that constant presence could never achieve. So, if you want to change how you are seen, if you want to shift the dynamic in your favor, if you want to move from being overlooked to being undeniable, you must make a decision, not a temporary adjustment, but a fundamental shift in how you operate. You must stop giving access freely. You must start controlling your presence. And you must be willing to let absence become part of your identity. Because in the end, the one who is always there is easy to replace, but the one who is not always available becomes impossible to ignore. And now that you see it, now that you understand it, the only question left is whether you will apply it or fall back into the same pattern that made you invisible in the first place. So read this again, not for motivation, but for awareness. Because the power is not in hearing it once. The power is in recognizing it every time you feel the urge to overgive, every time you feel the impulse to be instantly available, every time you forget that your value is not in how much you show up, but in how intentionally you choose when not to.